thank you everyone for joining this webinar from Australian Monitor for the Z624 product that's been newly released. My name is Ewan Brown. I'm the General Manager for Australian Monitor, and I'm joined by Peter Cleary, the Brand Manager at Amber Technology. So the two of us will be running through the capabilities of the Z624 in this webinar. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat. Peter will be moderating the chat and will relay any questions to me that need to be answered. And please ensure you've muted your microphones if you've joined. So firstly, what is the Z624 system? This is a bit of a busy slide, but it's really there to show the full capabilities of the system, and we'll go into more detail in further slides. So at its core, the Z624 is a mixing 6 input to 4 output zoning solution. We've deliberately designed this product to be very intuitive to use from the front panel of the product and to be easily set up and installed by entry-level audio integrators. And as you'll see in this presentation, it then has further capabilities in software, etc., to then really expand the capabilities of the system if you need that additional feature set. So at its core, we have 6 audio inputs in the system to 4 audio outputs, and I'll show you that in more detail in a moment. But we start with very simple audio mixing to 4 audio outputs. We can then expand the capability of the system by adding a paging station to the system, and that allows for paging to all of the zones individually or using all calls so that you can have that additional feature. And then finally, you can really expand the capability of the system using control panels and audio wall plates. And again, we'll go into more information on how all of that works shortly. So at its core, obviously, we have the Z624 product itself with its 6 inputs and the 4 outputs. As I mentioned before, the way that it was deliberately designed to be very easy to use, and that's what we're showing in the front face here, that for each audio input, you're using one of these selection buttons in order to route that audio to its corresponding output. So it's just a very simple case of pressing the button on the front panel in order to connect that input to the relevant zone output. So you would select all the way along each of the inputs to the output zone that you wish. There's always a volume control on each of the inputs, and the volume control is shared across all of the output zones. We then come to the outputs, and it has the volume control for the output along with a meter level and a bass and treble tone control for each of the outputs. In addition to the main Z624, we then have control panels, a WP4R, so that has 4 buttons and a rotary encoder for volume control, a WP10, which has 10 buttons for volume control, input source selection, etc., a WP Vol, which is volume control, and then we have audio wall panels. The audio wall panels are designed to sit in the zone and send audio back to the Z624 from that remote zone. Again, we'll explain how all of that works later. But there is a Bluetooth wall panel, the WP-BT here, and a WP-ML, which stands for mic line. So you can have both microphone and line inputs that then are fed back into the Z624. There is also control software that allows you to extend and expand some of the feature set of the Z624. It is predominantly designed to be an out-the-box solution that you can set it up from the front panel and from the rear panel, and you don't need the control software to do any of that. But if you want some of the more advanced features and customization, then you would need to use the control software. And as we will see when we're going through the control software, it does allow for a very easy setup of the system if that's the way that you choose to do the install. And then you have the Z624 PS, standing for paging station. So I, sorry, jumped slightly ahead there, but in terms of this is again how the input stage of the front panel works with its zone output selections and its volume controls, the bass and treble, and the output level controls.
Out of the box, it's actually identical from the front panel operation point of view to the older Amos ZRM4. So if you've been using the ZRM4 over the years, this will do exactly the same thing you could do with the ZRM4. But as Ewan's alluded to, there is a lot more toys and features with this guy that increases the flexibility of it and expands the amount of the type of installations it will suit.
Yep, so we'll see in the software later that out of the box, this works as a mixer, meaning that when you select an input, multiple inputs, they will mix together to go to the output. However, within the software, there is the capability to put it into matrix mode, which means that it will only allow one input to go to an output. So when you select another input, it will automatically disconnect any other input in that zone so that you're only ever listening to one input at a time. So you've got mix mode and matrix mode that this Z624 can do. So onto the back panel of the product. An awful lot going on here, and we'll break this down in further slides. But at its core, you have 6 audio inputs, both mic and line capable on the Euroblocks here and line on the RCAs. On input 1 and 2, you have, this is a bit small here, but you have the ability to set, is the Euroblock mic or line mode? Is it sending out phantom power if you're going to use microphones connected to it? And on inputs 1 and 2, it also has a high pass filter. So inputs 1 and 2 are predominantly there for microphones that are allowing for priority and talk over background music. We also have trim levels for you to set the appropriate level coming into the system. We then come over to the accessory ports, and this is one of the major additions for this new product. It allows you to connect remote wall panel controls and for the audio wall plates. And again, we'll go into that in more detail later. You then have the 4 zone outputs that would then connect to power amplifiers. We have a utility port, which is a USB-C port here, and that is for the control of the software. An integrated tone generator in the product. So there is 6 tones within the product, and these are contact closures, so you connect each of these to ground in order to play the corresponding tone within the system. There is a contact closure for mute and a 24-volt output. We'll go into that in a bit more detail in a further slide. We then have input priority on inputs 1 and 2. And again, in a further slide, we'll go into more detail on that and the ability to lock certain features of the product. So that's the back panel of the product. It is deliberately designed, as I've said before, that you can use these dip switches in order to set the system up without the requirement of the software. So that would be how you would typically set the system up. If it's an entry-level type system, you would be flicking these switches to the mode required and then integrating it with a power amplifier. In terms of the control panels, to jump into that into a bit more detail, with the WP4R, it has 4 buttons and the rotary encoder, and we'll show you in a future slide how the software can be configured to change the functions of those buttons. The WP10, very similar, that it just has more buttons on it, allowing you more control, and the WP Vol. All of these wall panels can be customized, if you wish, with HPM Vivo cover plates. So by default, we offer black and white versions of the wall panels, but you can buy these additional face plates to then have a whole different range of colors for the install. So when you connect these wall panels to the system, this is the default that they will, when When you connect it to the system, this is how the wall panels will control the system. As an example, in the WP4R, the first button will control is input 3 on or off, 4, 5, and 6, etc. So when you connect it, depending on the zone that you connect to, it's basically how that wall panel controls the system. So if I just jump back as an example, that on the accessory ports, when you connect wall panels to it, on that port A, if you connect a wall panel, that will then control zone A on the output in terms of the sources and the volume level. However, if you don't want the default when you've connected the wall panel to the system, that either you don't want the user to be able to select some of the sources that's maybe used for other parts of the system, or you don't want them to adjust the volume, again, within the software, you can disable and change those features. So we'll see this in more detail in the software, but just to give you an idea at the moment in terms of it has a wide selection within the software of on a button, you can then change the input source, how it's controlling the system. Is it playing pre-recorded messages, etc. So we'll see that in the software that we have a lot of customization possible within the control panels if you wish that to be the case in your system. But out of the box, it's there to control sources and volume and be very easy to use. And you could only use this if you're really trying to extend the feature set of the product. Moving on to the paging station. The Z624PS, it has a slimline gooseneck microphone, and it has the 4 output zones, so you can individually select these output buttons in order to page to the zones that you wish, or it has an all page button so that you don't need to select them and it will automatically page to all the zones. The Z624 supports 1 paging station. So the big brother of this product, called the Zone Mix, that system supports up to 16 paging stations. So if you do require more paging stations, you would need to upgrade to that Zone Mix solution. But for the Z624, when it's at that more entry-level point, for most applications, 1 paging station should be sufficient, and that's what we support in this system. Again, the paging station connects via Cat5 cable to one of those accessory ports, and again, I'll show you how that works later. Finally, onto the audio wall panels, we have the Bluetooth wall panel that allows us to support Bluetooth pairing within a local zone and feed that audio back into the Z624 for then distribution. And with the WPML, it does the same thing. With the Bluetooth wall panel from the software, you can change the name, PIN number, and security features. And again, you'll see that within the software. So that's one of the major upgrades in the Z624, in addition to the wall panel control, is the ability to then stream remote audio from the zone back into the system for mixing.
And you'll see on the right-hand side of that slide, there's the WP breakout box. When you connect the WPBT or the WPML direct to the Z624, it will only play in the zone, it will only work in the zone it is connected to. However, if you did want a routable Bluetooth connection or a routable mic line input connection, the breakout box will powers it, breaks it out to line level, and you can then plug it into one of the inputs on the Z624, and you've got a routable Bluetooth connection in the installation. And just as an aside, that breakout box will allow you to use either of those wall panels with any other amplifier, anything else with a line level input.
So I don't want to go too much into the detail of the wiring of the system on this webinar. It's a bit too detailed. One of the things I just want to show is that for each of the accessory ports, that they are locked to the associated zone, so A, B, C, D, corresponding to the output zones A, B, C, and D. And on each of the accessory ports, you can have up to 2 wall controllers, 2 audio wall plates, or if you have a paging station, it replaces one of the audio wall plates. So on the actual connection This uses standard Cat5. It is a proprietary protocol, so it is not using Ethernet. It is this protocol that's shown here. So we use RS485, 24-volt power, and then we have two audio inputs, remote input 1 and remote input 2, but remote input 2 is also shared with the paging stations. So if you have two audio wall plates in the system, you would connect the first one to the remote input 1 and the second to remote input 2. But if you are using the paging station, it uses the second input, which is why it is an OR if you have a paging station connected in a zone. The paging station can connect to any of the accessory ports. That's a choice for the installer. Just note that it will consume one of the audio plates. And finally, with the two audio wall plates, they are mixed internally in the Z624, and they come out of input 6. So the way that this works is you plug in the wall plates, they come into the accessory port. On the rear of the product, you can adjust the gain level, and then you need to activate one of the dip switches on the back corresponding to if you want to use the local input on that port. So as an example, on accessory port A, that would be the zone output A. You would then press this dip switch down, and what it does is it replaces input 6 on the front panel of the product. So I'm going to jump back to the front panel, and you'll note that on input 6, it has slightly different colored LEDs, that they're not green. So on input 1 to 5, they are standard inputs, but on input 6, if you choose to use a local input, it will replace the rear panel input 6. So if I come to here, if you had on input 6, say a CD player, for example, that would be shared on all output zones. But if you then decided I want to use a local input, which comes in on the accessory port, you turn the local enable on. That means that audio gets fed from this accessory port and replaces input 6 on that output zone. And that will be indicated by, instead of this LED being green, it will be amber, to tell the user that we are using the remote audio input instead of the rear input 6. So input 6 is basically shared between the accessory port audio inputs and input 6 on the back. Okay. And because these, I didn't say before, I'm sorry, that the remote inputs on this connector are standard balanced audio. So it does allow you, if you want to use any other form of audio input source, a balanced audio input source at line level, you can send it in through these accessory ports. And as an example, we have some input wall plates that Australian Monitor sells, and you could connect this in a remote zone and send balanced audio back into the system.
You'll also see there's the VC series of volume controls. They're the 100-volt line volume controls that you connect to a speaker line to a power amplifier. Very handy in situations. If you might have one or two zones that actually comprise of 3, 4, or 5 different rooms. By using those volume controls in the room, you can then adjust the level per room. It's all still the same zone, but you can have a different level in each sub-zone, if you like, for want of a better terminology. And they run from 10 watts up to 100 watts. And like everything else in our wall panel range, they're HPM Vivo compatible, so you can change the color of the outer face plates as you like. And as an aside, those WPXLR, 2XLR, etc. on the left there, they're now all Neutri connectors on those too.
So now delving into some of the features of the product in more detail, the priority in the Z624, it's a two-level priority scheme. So that means that on input 1 and input 2, you can turn them into priority inputs in the system. And when the system detects audio is coming in on input 1 or input 2, it will then mute input 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the way that that's accomplished is first you decide what is the mode that you want for the priority. The default is that this dip switch is in the off position, which means input 1, then input 2. So if input 1 will have priority over input 2. So if any audio is detected on input 1, for example, someone speaking into a microphone, it would then mute inputs 2 to 6 in that zone. However, if you wanted it to mix, you would then turn this dip switch in the on position, which means input 1 and 2 in mix mode. So if there are signals on either of the input 1 and 2, they would then mute inputs 3, 4, 5, and 6, and you would hear only those two mixed in the output zone. You then set the priority release if you wish, and priority release means once audio is no longer detected on inputs 1 and 2, it will then fade the audio back in for inputs 3, 4, 5, and 6. That can be set between 0 and 25 seconds, 0 meaning it immediately releases the audio and the background music, for example, starts playing again. Or if you want a more gentle fade to come in, you would then increase that to the number of seconds you wish. There's also an extended capability within the Z624 to decide where is the priority actually being actioned. So if the priority is detected on input 1 and 2, and again, based on the settings that we just described here, it then decides, okay, I need to go into priority, but we use these settings here to decide which output zones are affected by that priority. So in the example that I've created here, if you detect audio on input 1, it will take effect on zone A and B because they're in the on position. So priority is active in those two zones if audio is present on those inputs. However, it will not affect C and D. So on output zones C and D, what will happen is that it will still continue to mix audio from inputs 1 to 6, but it does depend on the source selection buttons that you have pressed on the front panel. So if you don't have an input selected that you want to listen to, it obviously wouldn't then come out the zone. But this is basically saying that the priority will not mute lower priority inputs. And again, on input 2, if there is audio detected on input 2, it will only affect zone B, meaning you would hear the audio in zone B for only input 2 because it's muted the lower priority inputs, but that would not be the case in A, C, and D. So that just gives you more flexibility in the system that if you have a zone that does not want priority to take effect, you would then turn off these dip switches in the zones that you didn't want priority to feature. Moving to tones and messages. So again, this is showing the rear panel that we have these 5 tone inputs that are embedded into the product, that when you close the contact, meaning you connect one of these inputs to the ground, it will then automatically play that tone. So we have these embedded within the system in terms of the audio is already pre-recorded in the system. However, if you wish to replace the tones, and it doesn't necessarily need to be tones, it could be an audio file of someone speaking, music, etc. If you chose to use it for that function, you can then use the SD card that is on the back of the product. So I'm just going to jump back because it's quite subtle. It's such a small connector that right in the middle of the back of the product, there is a micro SD card slot, and that allows you to then add custom messages and tones into the system. So the SD card is not provided in the system. That is something the customer has to provide, well, the installer has to provide. So you would put the files onto the SD card, and if you name them as shown here, evac.wav, etc., when you close that contact, it will then play your file that you wish instead of the embedded file. So typically these would be connected to things like big red buttons on a wall, or some form of automated control system. In addition to the tone generator, there is also a mute contact closure, and that is a global mute which will mute the entire system. And that's predominantly for things like fire panels, but again, it can be used for other from other control systems as well. Tone level can be set using the rear panel knob that's shown here. It can also be set within the software as well. So that's the tone generator. But in addition to the tone generator, there is also a message player within the product. So you can put files and music onto the SD card, and then in the software, you can then assign that to one of the wall panel buttons, and you can then play that file. So we'll show that in the software, but again, that sort of elevates the capabilities of the system, that you can have multiple audio files assigned to a wall panel, which can then be played back from a reception, for example. Moving to the lock functionality. So input 1 and 2 are predominantly used for priority inputs. They don't have to be, but if they are used for priority inputs, typically you don't want people being able to adjust the level or the ability to disable that priority going to an output zone. So that is why this lock feature exists within the product. And the way that it works is that you set the output zones that you wish the input to go to. So you would set them using the buttons on the front panel. You would then adjust it to the level that you wish, and do that for input 1 and 2, depending on what you want to use. And then on the rear panel of the product, you then use these dip switches, and once you turn them on, it immediately locks out these controls and effectively disables them to the user. So if the user comes back and attempts to press any of these buttons, it will ignore it, and the same for the volume control. The way that it's also reinforced to the user that that is an illegal operation they're doing, there are lock LEDs on the front panel of the product to tell them that these are both in a locked condition. So that gives you the capability to ensure that for priority inputs, for example, that the user isn't going to be able to change any of the settings during an install. On the outputs, we also have the capability of locking the outputs in the software. So that doesn't exist as a dip switch selection on the product, but it's an extended feature within the software that you could set the output levels, and within the software, disable the front panel controls. Again, for any user that's coming up and attempting to erroneously change the levels. One point to note, though, is that the wall panels will, if you are using wall panels, will still allow you to adjust the volume level. If you don't want that to happen, you can then customize the wall panels and remove the volume capabilities from that wall panel within the software. So you can totally lock out the volume adjustment on the output if you wish. So moving to the software, as I mentioned before, this is an extended feature of the Z624 that if we want to use more customized features within the product, we would use it. But it's also there to allow installers to easily commission the Z624. So it works in two modes, an offline mode and an online mode, that you could set the whole system up using offline mode. And then once a product is delivered, you can then just simply connect to it and upload your files. And obviously an online mode that you can easily just select everything immediately. These are all of the features. I won't mention them in detail now because we're about to go into a software demo, and I'll then show you the capabilities of the software. So this is the demo that I'm about to go through. It consists of the PC with the Z624 software connected to the utility port on the rear panel of the product, and that's a USB-C connection that's included in the product, the USB cable. We then have a paging station connected to Zone D, a WP10 connected to Zone B, and WP10 and a Bluetooth wall plate connected to Zone A. So I'll now jump over to the software. So this is the Z624 configuration software. And the way that it works is that we first of all start with the rear panel of the product. Most of the sections within the software have a little information icon, and that will allow you to read the meaning of each of the functions, but I'll briefly go over them here. So the first thing to do is, do we want to override the rear panel settings? So if I disable that, this would be the out of the box configuration for the product. That is, it is using the dip switches on the back of the product in order to configure the product. So that would be standard mode. However, if you're wanting to configure the system in software because you don't have access to the back of the product, you're commissioning it in an offline state, for example, you can then come in here and say, no, I want the software to take control and completely ignore the dip switches on the back of the product because I'm going to configure it in software. So this would be the setup that I explained in each of the sections in the presentation, that I had a lock activated on input 1, meaning that the user cannot change the volume level or the sources on input 1. I then have the input priority set on input 1 and input 2. And I also have a local audio input selected on Zone A. So how that corresponds, if I just come over here, the Bluetooth wall panel is coming in on the accessory port and is being used as a local audio input, which is why I have turned it on. That allows us to route the Bluetooth audio to input 6, and that is what is then used for Zone A. And I don't have local inputs on any of the other zones, so they're disabled. And then if I come back to the priority scheme that I was showing before, as I was showing before here with the two dip switches on input 1 and input 2, that is identical in the software, that this is the way that you would do it within the software. And then you can change the release time without using a knob here. So you can say that's the release time for the priority. So basically that's just an easy way of setting up the system without touching the rear panel. We then move to the wall plates, and what you will see, I've deliberately not connected anything to Zone C so that you can see the setup of the zone with nothing connected. But you have the option of connecting the WP10, the 4R or the volume, and there are 2 slots available, allowing you to connect 2 controllers to the system and the ability to connect 2 audio wall plates to the system as well. So I have a WP10 connected, the Bluetooth WP10 and the paging station in the system. There is an identify mode within the system, and that if you activate it, unfortunately I can't show you this, but on one of the wall panels that's connected, what it's doing is it's flashing its LEDs in order to show I am the wall panel that is currently in identify mode. So that's really there. If an installer comes into a system that has been installed for a year, for example, and if they have two WP10s in that zone, which one is which, to avoid them having to take the wall plates off the wall to identify which is which, they can come in and turn on the identify mode, see, okay, it's that wall plate, and then they can come in and make any changes that they wish. So when you pair wall plates to the system, you will get them added as shown here. And then once you come into configure, you can then see the screen here. And very self-explanatory that as soon as you go into any of the buttons, you get these options. So it gives you the ability to come in and say, which zone do you want to control and which input do you want to control within that zone? So that allows you to disable or change. So as I mentioned before, that this is the default when the system is paired for a WP10, that it has inputs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the output master volume. But if you didn't want a customer to have access to input 1, for example, if that was a priority input, you could then come in and disable it. So again, preventing customers being able to affect inputs that you don't want them to have access to. Or if you don't have 6 input sources because you only need 2 or 3, it obviously doesn't really make sense to have these additional buttons selecting sources that don't exist. So you would then come in and say, I want to disable 5 and 6 so that those are removed as options for the customer. Once you've configured the systems, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So that is the zone input select. You also have the ability to do zone volume and to mute each of the corresponding outputs. As I mentioned before, with the pre-recorded messages, you come into this option within the button and click Browse. And this is showing the content of the micro SD card that is inserted into the Z624 that I'm connected to at the moment. So you would put files from your PC into the SD card and then connect them into the system, and then select them from here. Once you do that, it gives you the capability of coming in here and selecting which output zone you want that message to be sent to. So just coming back in here, that's the view that you get.
Okay. And you'll notice on that that view there, there's also a button at the top that says Upload File. Now, what that allows you to do, if you've got a music file on your PC that you want put on the SD card, you don't have to run down to the rack room, get to the back of the thing, pull the SD card out, put it on and put the SD card back in. You can just do that and it'll upload whatever file you want to the SD card via the connection.
Thank you, Peter. And one additional use case that I want to highlight with the wall panels, that as a default, the wall panels are controlling the zone which they are connected to. However, that doesn't have to be the case. That if I come back in and select, for example, this case, so excuse me a moment while I do this. But what I'm doing here is creating a master wall plate. So this can connect to any of the accessory ports, but because I have reconfigured it from the default, this could be, as an example, in a reception, that it has control over all of the output zone levels using one wall plate, that you're controlling zone A, B, C, and D from this wall plate. That corresponds also with what we just showed you in terms of the messages. If I'm selecting one of them, you would normally have it going to the local zone, but that doesn't have to be the case. That you could have that one button press actually transmit that message to all output zones. So again, really adding some additional features to the capabilities to the Z624 product. So that's how you would configure each of the wall panels to the setup that you require. And then finally, we move into the advanced. Now, there's an awful lot of text here because it does require a bit of explanation in terms of the meaning of each of them, and I'll try to summarize them as best I can. So with the input priority, normally what you would want to do is have a fixed level that goes to the output zones that you want to send that to. That is typically when you are doing voiceover that you want a very consistent level, that it isn't turned down. We can lock that out as I previously discussed, but if you don't have the lock, you want the priority level to come out without being affected by the master volume to prevent users muting it, turning it down, and then you don't hear it. So by default, the system ships that it is post the master volume, meaning it comes after the volume and completely ignores that master volume, and the input just comes straight out irrespective of it. However, if you do want it to be affected by the pre-master, depending on your setup, you are then able to then change the way that the priority works and will be before the master and honor if any changes have been made. Paging over priority, pretty self-explanatory that, excuse me, if you're doing a page, will that take precedence over the priority inputs 1 and 2? And if you don't, then you would reverse it the other way. With the paging station, again, how do you want it to work? Do you want it to be after the master volume or before the master volume? And then we mentioned this right at the start of the presentation, that how do you want the system to work? By default, you can select multiple inputs and they will mix together to the output, which is mixer mode. However, if you want, you can change it to matrix mode, meaning only one input can be selected at any time to go to the output.
That matrix mode would probably be used most often when you're controlling the inputs going to a zone from a wall panel. So most commonly they want this input or that input or that input in the zone. So then you'd set it to matrix mode so they can only choose one input per zone.
And with the tone generator, there is also the ability to change the level of the tones that come out. So if you did choose to customize the tones and you were using voice files or whatever else you needed to use, if the levels of them are different, rather than re-recording those levels, you can then do adjustments in here in order to change the relative level of the tones that are being played. But equally, if you want to use the integrated tones, that you may want the evac level at the loudest level, and then if you're using an intruder or a bell or chime, for example, you probably don't want those at the same extremely loud level for people to evacuate. So you could then modify these and make them -20 relative to the evac tone, for example. And there's also the ability in the paging station to apply offsets for each of the zones. So one example of that would be if you have an office space, you obviously have a more quiet environment and you don't want the paging station to be too loud. But if you're in a warehouse, you do need it to cut through all of the noise. That's where you would be setting these, that maybe in an office environment, you're dropping it by 30 dB, for example. So we have that capability as well. The system has the ability to do a pre-announced chime. So when you are doing a zone page or all page on the paging station, it will play that pre-announced chime. I didn't mention before, but you can also customize that pre-announced chime by adding it to the SD card. But when that pre-announced chime is enabled, you can then set the corresponding level on here. And if I just jump back to the presentation, actually, that is one thing that I did miss. That right on the end, there's a dip switch here, which turns actually there's a better image here. The paging chime, there's a dip switch to turn that on and off via the back panel as well. And finally, as I mentioned previously on the lock, you have the ability to then turn on the lock for each of the output zones as well if you don't want them to modify the levels. And just some tidy up stuff on the software. You have the ability to import configurations and also export them, save them from previous installs that you're doing and reuse them. Software manuals, our website, etc. And then if you need to restore, you can then choose to restore only the audio settings, the wall panels, or reset everything within the system. And once you've set all of that up, as the red text is showing you at the top, you do need to save that to the system. So with all of these changes, you would then hit the send configuration to the device in order for all of these settings to take effect. So that is the Z624 software. And if we then move to the next page, some application notes which Peter will guide you through.
Thank you. Thank you. What we have here is a couple of slides showing you some typical applications that you could use the Z624 platform for. The first one there is basic zoning with paging. It's a simple system intended to be controlled from the front panel. There's a couple of wireless microphones connected to it and BGM sources for CD, DAB radio and routable Bluetooth connected to a HSP amplifier feeding 4 zones. Nice and simple, inexpensive and easy to use. The paging station set up to page to the zones, and you'll also see down there a device we haven't mentioned during this, which is the True Blue, which is a Bluetooth receiver, fully programmable Bluetooth receiver that is set to input 6 there, and that can then be also routed as required to each of the zones. Moving on to the next one, takes it a little step further. This is a suggested configuration for a house of worship church type install. You've got multiple microphones going in there, 4 wireless mics throughout the installation, BGM source, and a mixing console going in there too if they do have live music in the venue. Going out to 4 zones. Now the zones are set up. Zones 1, 2, and 3 are the body of the church themselves. We've got column speakers in the main part of the church, rear fills and rear fills for the rear of the church. They're all zones 1 and 2. Zone 3 is for the parents' room or the crying room that can have its own volume level in there. And zone 3 is external horns for outside areas of the church. And the 4th zone is going to the hearing assistance system inside the church. Now, what that will allow you to do is send various inputs to various parts of the church at different levels and control how it's all working in a nice economical package for a house of worship application. Next one. This is a maxed out system to show exactly what you can do with the Z624. We've got inputs, BGM and wireless mics, as well as paging going into the Z624, going out to 4 zones, and you can see each zone has up to 4 wall panels connected to it. That's 2 control panels and 2 line level input, and a line level and a Bluetooth panel on the first zone, Bluetooth only in the second, 2 Bluetooth and a Bluetooth and line level in the other zone. You would do that where you've got very big rooms as the zones where you may want some control up either end of the room, so you don't have to run from one end of the room to the other to adjust the inputs or the volume level, or like we have there in zone B, a control panel controlling exactly what's coming into the zone, and then a separate volume control at the other end of the room where they can adjust the levels of the volume levels within the room itself. And the paging station, as you can see there, instead of the previous example showing it connected straight to the zone mix, that is tacked onto zone B, and that paging station can be wherever in the installation you need it to be, and it will then allow you to page and do announcements throughout the whole installation.
Thank you. And those application notes are all on the Australian Monitor website, so you can look at those in further detail and download them.
Power amplifiers. Suggested companion power amplifiers for it. You can use either the ESP series of power amps, which is a nice economical basic power amps, single channel 120 and 250 and 500 watt, as well as a 2x120 and a 4x80 watt power amplifier there. Moving up, we go to the HSP series, which is what was shown mainly in the application notes. The HSPs are either 2x or 4x120 watt, or 2x or 4x250 watt. The outputs are either low impedance or high impedance, and they're programmable via a separate PC application. Now, that application will allow you to set up mixing within the power amplifier itself. You can have an input going to put the input 1 and route that to all 4 outputs or only 2 of the outputs. That's the sort of thing I used in the House of Worship application, where you got the one input going to multiple zones to feed the body of the church and another input into the same power amp feeding the crying room. And it's a great way to do it. Mini DSP gives you volume control, input and output routing, as I said, high and low pass filtering, and compressor limiter in there as well. And they are also RS-232 controllable.
Thank you, Peter. And finally, I just wanted to highlight that on our website, you will find all of the information on the Z624 product, the brochure, the manual, the software. Want to also highlight the wiring guide. I have not gone into it in any detail, but there is a full wiring guide on how all of the wall panels and paging stations should be connected to the system, supported lengths of cables, etc. All of that is within the wiring guide. There's an application example section which shows the examples that were just shown. And finally, there is an overview video which will highlight the major features of the Z624 product. So thank you for your time, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer that now.
I'll wait and see if any questions come into the chat. Thank you for your time with that, guys. There was a lot of information there, and if you've got any further questions or queries on it, please reach out to either your account manager or Ewan or myself, and we'd be happy to take you to it. And the other Ewan, who's on the call too in our TSS team, Ewan Lund, would be more than happy to talk to you about how this will suit your application and what you can do with it.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.